Good day, ma'am. Good day, classmate. My name is Razel Jane Sorial. My report is about starch production and sources. Starch is a common constituent of higher plants is a major in which carbohydrates are stored. It is produced by green plants for energy storage and it is synthesized in granular form. Starch is present in most even grain plants from reserve organs of many plants. The basic part of starch is amylose and amylopectin. Importance of starch. Aside from their basic nutritional uses, starches are used in brewing and thickening agents in baked goods and confections. Starch is used in paper manufacturing to increase the strength of paper and also used in the surface sizing of paper. What is the difference between starch and flour? The difference between starch and flour is there are many differences of them. Starch is a simple carbohydrate and does not contain any flour. It contains ample calories. Starch is a soft, white, tasteless powder that is insoluble in cold water. There are two types of starch. It is amylose and amylopectin. Flour is a powder that results from crushing raw whole grams, and flour contains high levels of starch and it contains some protein and mineral. This is the difference between starch and flour. The common source of starch is bread, grains, cereals, pasta, rice, potatoes, peas, corn, and beans. This is the common source of starch. Is the process in starch production. The production of the potato starch comprises the steps. I have a diagram about what is the process of starch production and I have a already video from the YouTube.
In a previous video, I covered the iodine clock reaction. This is a reaction where two colorless solutions are mixed, and after a certain period of time, a sudden color change occurs. One of the colorless solutions that's used contains starch, and at the time I only had cornstarch, so you can see in the video that it was a little bit opaque. In the future, I plan to revisit the reaction called the Briggs-Rauscher oscillating clock reaction, which also uses starch. If I use cornstarch again, I'll have an opaque solution, and I really want to have a nice clear one, so for this, I need to prepare some potato starch. In general, starch is stored as granules in plant cells, and to get it out, we need to destroy the cells. To get the starch from potatoes, we just need to mechanically break the cells apart using something like a cheese grater, and then separate the starch from the potato shavings by washing them with water followed by filtration. The process that I show in this video isn't the most efficient, but I still do get a decent amount, and a little bit of starch tends to go a long way. For the extraction of starch from potatoes, we want to use ones that have the highest starch content, and these are the Idaho potatoes and the russets. For this video, I'm using 4 large russet potatoes, but the size really doesn't matter, and if you use smaller ones, you'll just have to do a lot more peeling. So speaking of peeling, I went ahead and I peeled all of the potatoes simply using a potato peeler. I placed the potatoes in a glass dish, and then I used a cheese grater to grind them up. It's very important that when you're doing this that you don't get too excited and accidentally shade your finger a little bit, so be careful. The starch that we're trying to extract is held and stored inside the cells of the potato, and to get it out, we have to destroy the cells. Ideally, the best way to destroy the cells would be to completely crush the potato and turn it into a paste, but that can kind of make it a little bit messy to work with. I found that it's better just to shred the potatoes because even though the yield of starch is less, it's a lot easier to work with than a mashed up paste. If we're pretty quick, just after a few minutes, we should be nearly done shredding all of the potatoes. Once we're done shredding everything, we don't need the cheese grater anymore, so we can clean it and put it aside. To all of the shredded potatoes, we then add a bunch of lukewarm water. The amount of water that's used is pretty arbitrary, and it really depends on how many potato shavings you have. When the potatoes were shaved, a lot of the cells were destroyed and they released their starch, and we're just trying to wash away the starch into the water. Starch is really not very soluble in water, so once we're done, we'll have a mixture of potatoes and starch floating around. I did the extraction in this glass dish for demonstration purposes, but it really isn't the best thing to use. I would recommend using something like a plastic bucket or container because it's a lot easier to pour from. Once we feel like we've done a good washing of the potatoes, the next thing that we do is we try to pour off the liquid. We try to hold back as many of the potato pieces as possible, but inevitably some will be poured out. This is okay though because the first few washings are just rough washings and it really doesn't matter. I went ahead and washed the potatoes a couple more times using roughly the same amount of water. A little bit covering the starch at the bottom. I then set up a strainer over a beaker and I filter our starch potato mixture. The starch is a hard clump at the bottom of the bowl, so it's important to mix it up before you try to filter things. The strainer worked pretty well, and it actually stopped pretty much all of the potato pieces from going through. A quick water washing is also done to get rid of any starch that might remain in the bowl, and also to wash the potatoes a little bit. The strainer is then removed, and these potatoes can also be thrown out or used for something else. We let it sit for a bit, and just after a few minutes, we can already see some starch collecting at the bottom. After leaving it for an hour, the solution has darkened a lot, and we can see a lot of starch at the bottom. This brown water above contains little to no starch, and we don't really want it, so we just decant it and get rid of it. To try to clean the starch up, we pour in a little bit of distilled water and mix things around. The starch is then mixed very thoroughly to make sure that all of it comes in contact with the water and gets a good washing. Once we've mixed things for a little while and we're satisfied that everything is washed quite well, we let it stand for a little bit and allow the starch to settle to the bottom again. When we come back in 20 or 30 minutes, we again have a brown solution on top, which we decant off. More distilled water is then added to the starch, it's thoroughly mixed, and the starch is again allowed to settle at the bottom. After the second or third washing, the water was only slightly discolored, and for me I felt like this was clean enough. Using a spoon, I transferred all of the starch to a watch glass to dry. Like cornstarch, it can be fun to play with, but when I did this, I kind of cracked my watch glass in half. When this happened, I just quickly transferred it to a piece of printing paper with a little bit of paper towel underneath, and I left it out for...
What are the components of cereal grains? Root crops are removed during starch production. In their natural, unprocessed, whole grain form, cereals are a rich source of vitamins, minerals, carbohydrates, fats, oils, and protein. When processed by the removal of the brain, germ, while removing endosperm is mostly carbohydrate.